Let me tell you something strange that's happening in BC forestry right now. Both the pro-industry crowd and the environmental crowd are furious at the BC government, and for completely different reasons. But they've landed on the same conclusion. Nobody trusts the BC government to manage forests properly. Not workers, rural communities, or conservationists. Pro-industry people are furious because mills are shutting down. They say government isn't giving out enough permits. They blame environmentalists. Environmental people are furious because industry is still flattening ecosystems. And the Minister of Forests publicly claims BC doesn't do clear cutting anymore. Different politics, different priorities, same conclusion. BC's forest management system is broken, and everyone can see it now. What people don't agree on is why. Now, the numbers back the brokenness. Since 2005, 44 mills have closed permanently. Forestry now makes up less than 2% of the provincial employment, and it only contributes 2% to BC's GDP. People are frustrated, and I don't blame them. But here's the detail nobody ever talks about. Most of the arguments you hear people making online collapse the second you look at the actual data. After our mill closures and supply collapse videos, the comments were flooded with the same lines. I see lots of trees where I live, just give out more permits, must be the NDP, environmentalists killed the jobs, and BC has plenty of fiber. Government is just not categorizing it properly. But the truth is simple. What people see from the highway has nothing to do with the real timber supply. And permits don't magically create forests. So in this video, I'm breaking down the 5 biggest myths driving the BC forestry debate. Myths that fall apart once you look at the real numbers, the real stand structure, and the real economics. Myth number 1, there's lots of forest, so there must be lots of timber. Here's the reality. Seeing trees is not the same as having merchantable timber. Merchantable timber means trees you can log at a profit. You can stand in the middle of some trees on the landscape and be looking at non-merchantable stands. They're too small, poor quality, too slow growing, low volume second growth, plantations that are under 40 years old, steep, inoperable terrain, forest that's too far from a mill to make it profitable, areas that are off limits to logging, like riparian reserves, wildlife buffers, retention patches, and any area that's not part of the BC Timber Harvesting Land Base, the THLB. The THLB is the part of public forests that industry is legally allowed to actually log, not the whole forest. And the fact is that much of BC's working forest, the THLB, is now a giant patchwork of logging roads, clear cuts, and young fire-vulnerable plantations. Companies don't make decisions based on what the forest looks like. They make decisions based on what they can actually log. They're shutting mills because the economically viable timber has collapsed. So when someone says there's lots of forest, the real answer is yes, there's lots of young forest and/or forest that's not economically viable. It's a combination of not enough mature, high-volume timber left to run the old system, and that what is left is not necessarily close enough to mills. According to a 2025 report, BC already degraded or deforested 18 million hectares of the provincial inventory. And 70% of all degraded forest is on the same sites that used to grow BC's biggest, highest value trees. The government and forest industry knew this fall down was coming way back in the 80s. This is a clip from a 1980 film called The Fall Down Effect by the BC Forest Service. The man talking is John Cuthbert, the chief forester of BC.
From the second crop, we will be cutting much younger trees. So the volume in the second rotation will be less per acre than from the old stockpile. That old stockpile was a bonus, a gift from nature, but we won't have it the next time around.
He told us 45 years ago, BC just didn't listen. Let's take a look at the age of some of BC's interior forests in 2020. Now, this is important because the 28 timber supply areas, the TSAs, in BC's interior represent nearly 70% of BC's allowable annual cut. In the Lakes TSA near Burns Lake, 40% of the THLB is under 20 years old, and over half of that is under 10 years old. In the 100-mile TSA, 33% of the THLB was under 20 years old. Quesnel, Kamloops, Prince George TSAs, 26% of the working forest were bare clearcuts and plantations under 20 years old. That's not the timber industry needs. That's future timber a long time away. Here's another harsh reality. A recent report about the Mackenzie timber supply area and another report about the Boundary TSA show how badly the BC government overestimated timber over the past 25 years. The BC government allowable annual cut has counted stands that don't exist, that are too small to log, and too far to log economically. They used growth curves not supported by ground data, relied on plantations that don't even exist yet, and ignored regional climate stresses, meaning drought has been and will continue to be a big problem in BC tree plantations. So you can drive through a green-looking landscape and still be in a fiber-short region. Not to mention, if you're sticking to main roads, most of what you're seeing are the so-called unlogged beauty strips that industry leaves along the roads to hide the clear cuts behind them. Let's take a look at a high-elevation clear cut in the Kettle River watershed. The lighter green areas are clear cuts about 20 years old. You can see the dark areas in between that were left unlogged. If you were walking through that dark area, it would feel like a lush forest filled with mature trees. But the surrounding second growth isn't yet old enough to log, and the fragments in between are not worth logging, and they're probably riparian reserves that can't be legally logged. Here are pictures of more fragments. Let's take a peek at the film from 1980 again, where he talks about the provincial cut.
As we said earlier in the film, wood harvest rose by more than 300% between 1950 and 1980. The present harvest level is about 75 million cubic meters of wood per year.
So that makes the actual harvest level in 1950 about 19 million cubic meters. In 1980, it went up to 75 million cubic meters. In 2015, the provincial cut was 69 million. By 2023, that number had fallen to 39 million. And for 2025, it's projected to drop to around 35 million cubic meters, the lowest harvest level since the 1960s. That's not a dip, that's a collapse. It's the predicted fall down. The province still pretends the allowable annual cut is 75 million cubic meters, but they can't even hit half that because the wood isn't there. The old high-value stands are gone. What's left is smaller, steeper, drier, or further away. On the ground, loggers call what's left in many second-growth stands pecker pools. You can have a forest with little to no merchantable timber, and that doesn't run a sawmill. This myth drives half the arguments online, and it collapses once you look at the data. Myth number 2. Mills are closing because government won't give out enough logging permits. That sounds logical until you look at the economics. The reality is, permits don't create logs. Canfor is saying it, West Fraser is saying it. They're closing mills because they can't access economically viable timber. When the profitable timber disappears, the mills disappear with it. Logs might exist, but the cost to get them has gone through the roof. The logs are smaller, they're further away, lower quality, on steep terrain. The haul distance kills the margin, and now there are higher tariffs and duties stacked on top. Interior mills were designed for massive old spruce and pine. Those are gone. That's why industry is putting on the pressure to log in provincial parks, and the Minister of Forests says he's okay with that. The industry built monster mills that can't adapt. High-throughput super mills collapse when the supply tightens. Small local mills that could have adapted were wiped out decades ago. A forest of scattered pockets of low-value wood, 20 to 40-year-old pine, second growth, and 150-kilometer haul distances cannot run a monster mill. Haul distance is a real killer. People thinking trees in northern BC should feed mills in central BC? That's not how economics work. This CCPA piece explains how insane the haul distances have become. Truckers are talking about 10-hour round trips to haul a single load. Once you add distance plus fuel, the economics collapse. You can issue 1,000 permits for timber that doesn't exist, is too small, is too far, is on inoperable terrain, and is too low volume to pay for fuel. Permits don't create logs. Inventory creates logs. And BC's inventory has collapsed. Myth number 3, environmentalists and/or the NDP killed the jobs. This is one of the most popular political myths. Here's the reality. This isn't a 4-year or an 8-year problem. This is a 50-year problem. The interior cuts soared during the Beetle era. In addition to the Beetle stands, government and companies hammered the best stands for decades, knowing full well the falldown was coming, and just kicked it down the road. They logged the old pine, the healthy spruce, the accessible stands, the flat ground, and they pushed for maximum volume. Now BC is in that falldown. Take a look at the logging in the Boundary TSA over the past 20 years. This TSA is mostly guts and feathers. Our retired loggers, Stan Sonarchuk and Wayne Tibloose, showed us on the ground what that looks like. This is the inevitable crash the industry and government built together. Blaming environmentalists is like blaming the fire alarm for the fire, especially since old growth deferrals that industry complains about are still getting logged. This report found that more than 50,000 hectares of the supposedly deferred old growth was where permits had already been applied for, approved, or the stands were already logged. At this point, less than 5% of the high productivity old growth that's left is actually protected. Not to mention, both major parties in BC approved inflated AACs. Don't get me wrong, I'm not giving the BC NDP a pass here. No way. Neither party has defined sustainability in law. Neither stopped the overcutting. This myth is a political deflection, not real analysis. Myth number 4, forests are renewable, so we can't run out. Forests are renewable, but renewable does not mean invincible. It doesn't mean you can log anything you want forever. It doesn't mean the next rotation will replace the old one. Forests are governed by ecological limits: soil, water, local climate, species, fire, disease, and most of all, time. BC's old forests took thousands of years to develop. You can plant a tree farm, but you can't plant a forest. If you harvest too much old forest too fast and replace it with young monoculture plantations that are smaller, drier, more flammable, more vulnerable, and less productive, the result is a degraded landscape that cannot support the old industry. BC built its logging system on old trees. Those trees are gone, and the plantations replacing them will never reach the same volume or value under current climatic conditions in BC, and certainly not during my lifetime or yours. Drought has been a serious problem for almost 10 years and continues to be a serious problem. Trees are struggling to grow, and some companies have resorted to planting hybrid, non-native species on the landscape. Remember the chief forester warned in 1980 that the second rotation would be smaller and produce less wood per acre? That's exactly what happens. We're living in the consequences of ignoring that warning. Finally, myth number 5. We just need technical fixes. Professional foresters, all trained the same way in BC, love technician fixes for a structural failure. They say things like split the TSAs, segregate balsam as in the stats, recalibrate the AAC, tweak species curves, adjust timber flow math. Really, That is the fix that a professional forester sent to me after our previous videos. A whole long email filled with this stuff. The problem is, those are all micro adjustments inside a collapsing system. It's like the engine has seized and they want to put different knobs on the dashboard. BC didn't fail because a spreadsheet mixed balsam into the AAC with larch. BC failed because the entire volume-based industrial model no longer works in a degraded landscape with collapsing stand volume. It's not a spreadsheet problem. It's a system failure. You don't fix a seized engine by adding finer-tuned dashboard gauges. And this myth brings us to the solution. We're pushing the new Forest Act framework, which is a completely new forest management system, not just better spreadsheets. It's not about left or right. It's not about industry versus environmentalists. Although our proposed system won't make the corporate people stuck in the volume-based system very happy. This framework is about building a forestry system based on what the land can actually sustain, not on inflated numbers or political pressure. BC's forests are at the point where pretending isn't an option. We need a governance model grounded in ecological limits and community-based decision-making, not the ghost of what used to be 50 years ago. The new Forest Act framework shifts BC from volume-driven industrial logging to nature-directed stewardship, treating forests as critical public infrastructure for water security, flood and fire protection, biodiversity, and community stability. It replaces the current regime with outcomes-first rules and community-centered governance. What changes on the ground is that outcomes take precedence over volumes, so the forests keep functioning. There's connected cover, clean water, stable slopes, living soil carbon, and wildlife habitat. Logging can continue, but differently. It will be selection, partial cutting, minimal roads, high structural retention on the landscape, and hydrology-led layout. BC-based jobs will shift and grow. There are plenty of jobs to be had in restoration, monitoring, planning, regional sorting, local mills, and value-added manufacturing. That means more jobs per cubic meter and steadier community work than in the industrial extraction and exporting model. You can download the new Forest Act proposal using the link in the description. In our next video, I'm going to show you why the province keeps pretending the allowable annual cut is sustainable, and how political incentives make it almost impossible for any government to tell the truth about the real timber supply. Because once you understand that, everything finally makes sense.